I'm Larry Menti. Welcome to Jersey Matters. It may be the most important story in the state of New Jersey, the underfunding of the state pension system that threatens to cripple the state economy. And yet, the story itself goes largely ignored, especially by politicians in Trenton. One gentleman that's not ignoring it is Michael Symons, who is a reporter for the Asbury Park Press and APP.com. I saw your story on this. What is the state of the state pension system now?
Underfunded as it has been for a long time and getting worse. At this point, it's more than $40 billion underfunded. The amount of money that they have currently compared to the amount that has been promised to current retirees and the benefits that have been earned by current employees.
And how did this happen?
Well, since 1998, 7, somewhere in that area, the mid-1990s, the state hasn't been putting in the kinds of contributions that it had been in the past. At first, that was because it had a small unfunded liability, chose to essentially borrow money to fill that liability on the hope that by doing that, the stock market investments and the regular investments that were made would keep the system whole going into the future. Shortly after that is when the big stock market correction around 2000 had happened, and investments didn't come near to keeping up with what was promised. At that point, the state had kind of gotten off the train of making the size payments that it should have, and it's found it exceedingly difficult to start getting back on that beam.
So when you don't make your payments, and correct me if I'm wrong on any of this, when you don't make the payments that you need to fund the pension program year after year after year for 25 years, you get to this situation. Is it fixable?
Well, if the state were putting in the amount of money that the actuaries say should be put in. Essentially, every year they study it and they come up with how much in the hole it is. And then the actuaries say, and here are the annual payments that you should be making to keep up with that. Those payments at this point should be approaching $4.5 billion a year, which it's 4 to 4.5. If you do the math, essentially the amount that the state is shorting the contribution would amount to about 10% of the overall state budget. So if you followed what the actuaries say, sure, over the course of a few decades, you would get the system whole again. But it's a large amount of money, and it's not easy to find that kind of money in the budget, either from cutting spending on things that would have to be pretty significant cuts, or tax increases of a pretty sizable amount that would also be unpopular.
But there's not the will to do any of that, it seems. It seems like it has been purposely underfunded for years because there is some feeling, and maybe even with the governor, that he is against the pension system as it stands anyway.
Early in Governor Christie's first term, they passed, actually the first law that he signed had to do with the pension system. And it promised that the state, over the course of 7 years, would gradually ramp up those payments to be the full amount that the actuaries wanted. And doing so was supposed to basically reduce that shock to the system. So if in the first year you were putting in $500 million, and in the second year you were putting in $1 billion, and you were working your way up, the natural growth in the budget and the natural growth in taxes, most of that would wind up going into the pension fund, not into other things. But over the course of 7 years, you would finally get back up to making those full payments. The state made those payments for the first couple of years. Along the way, they passed additional reforms that were intended to, on both the pension and the health care side, make some changes. It shifted more cost over to employees. It reduced some benefits. And over the course of time, had the state been keeping up with that 7-year payment, it wouldn't have been easy, but it could have gotten there. The state's revenues weren't what they were supposed to be, and so the pension payment became a first easy thing to cut. The way that the state budget cycle works is that they make that payment at the end of June, right at the very end of the budget season. So if you have a year when the revenues miss, it's the first easiest and almost the only target left.
Right, and we're talking about two different things. I understand them trying to make the pension fund solvent and to try to fund that, and I understand the problems with that. The pension system itself and the fact that people get promised a pension, I believe can be two separate issues. So when I say that the governor may not be supportive of the pension system, he doesn't think that going forward that that people promising a pension is probably the best way for a government to go, for the state government to go.
Okay, yeah, as a candidate the first time that he ran and as governor, he has been advocating to put new employees into a system that is more like a 401k. And
Which, by the way, private companies have done. There used to be pensions that you were promised in big corporations, and they've gotten away from that.
Correct, and that's kind of one of the points the governor makes, is that this isn't done anywhere else anymore, and so it's something that we should move away from in the public sector, in his estimation. And he had proposed that at one point. He put together a task force that was putting together some recommendations, and one of them was to create essentially a sort of a hybrid system. The management of the investments would have been more or less handed off to the unions, so that they would be in charge of managing the investments that would fund their employees' benefits going forward. And he was going to work. His task force had been working with the New Jersey Education Association on some of this. Once it became public, it proved controversial. The teachers union said, you're overstating the agreement that we had, and over the course of a few weeks or months, it didn't really go anywhere. The NJEA backed out of the agreement.
It's politically unpopular.
Sure.
It's politically unpopular, and yet, without that as a solution, what is the solution? Because if the state were a corporation with this debt it owes to the pension, it would be bankrupt. It would have to declare bankruptcy. I know the state can't, but if they're going to keep underfunding, and if they can't afford to fund at whatever the mandated level is, or whatever they feel like it needs to bring it back to full funding, then what?
Right. So one of the ideas that the state is currently talking about, and they haven't decided, I mentioned earlier that they had that idea of basically over the course of 7 years stepping up those payments, saying, okay, what if we stepped it up over 10 years? Maybe that's more manageable. And so outside of eventually making those large payments, there really isn't currently a solution on the table. Governor Christie has put out there the idea of additional reductions to benefits, and it hasn't gone anywhere with the legislature. And the closer that he gets to the end of his term, the less leverage he's going to have to try to get something like that through the legislature. So there isn't a solution. It sounds like
everybody's irresponsible on this. It sounds like nobody wants to give up what they have, and nobody wants to pay more, and they know it's politically unpopular to even bring it up and say we need more money from taxpayers or we have to cut something. And so it's just allowed to keep getting worse, and then the solutions become further and further away, less palatable.
Yeah, I mean, the solutions are really difficult. The Democrats in the legislature would say part of the problem is that the state's economy hasn't rebounded like other states have, and therefore the extra money that the state thought that it was going to be receiving and thought it could put into the pension fund hasn't materialized. So they would make the case that part of the solution is have a better economy, and then that'll lead to the state having more money.
Yeah, it would have to be much better.
Yes.
But realistically, that's not going to be enough at this time. And I guess the frustrating thing for citizens of New Jersey is that nobody seems to be seriously dealing with this problem. It comes up every once in a while in reporting by you and I guess when someone's campaigning, but during the course of governing, it doesn't happen.
Yeah, I mean, it gets talked about in Trenton a lot. There's a big court case going on right now. The unions they're running ads now to try to draw attention to it and pressure Christie on the issue. So the solutions are hard to find, but there's certainly increasing noise around the problem.
Yeah. Mike, thank you so much for your reporting.
Thanks,
we're going to continue with this topic and talk to a representative of the teachers union when we come right back on Jersey Matters.